Okay, well, look, we got a good number of people in the meetup now. I'll keep accepting people as they come in. As I said, great to see such a good turnout again, guys. Thanks for everyone taking the time out to attend Mobile London. It's good to see some regular faces or regular names sort of attending. I hope you're obviously all well. As you know, these events are recorded. They will be up on YouTube either today or the day after. So if you've got any colleagues or friends that you'd like to share these with, please feel free to do so. On the side of things, Mobile London, we've got a number of talks coming up over the next few weeks. So stay in touch over the meetup page. As you know, you get the notifications come through. Aside from meetups, if anyone is looking for a new role at the moment, as always, feel free to reach out to myself. You can even message me on LinkedIn, drop me an email, or even message me on the meetup page if you've got any questions or if you are looking yourself. But yeah, no, I think that's about it from my side. I'll pass this over to Teresa now. With questions, we're going to do questions halfway through the PowerPoint using the chat box, and then at the end as well using the chat box. But yeah, guys, I hope you enjoyed the talk. And yeah, over to Teresa. Over to you.
Hi, everyone. Nice to meet you. And thanks for joining me today for the talk. And thanks for Tommy to arrange this meetup.
Cheers.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to share my screen so you can see my slides. Yeah, just a second, sorry.
Hello there.
Hi. Can you see my screen?
Yeah, that's all good. We can see it, Teresa.
Okay,
Yep.
great. I'm going to give a brief introduction of myself. My name is Teresa. I work for Tide. And for those who haven't heard about Tide, right? We provide banking service for a small business in the UK. And at the moment, we have reached 150,000 of customers, and we are still expanding and we are still growing. Right now, we have tech teams in 3 locations. We have in London, we have in Sofia, that's in Bulgaria, and we have one in India. And we are looking to grow the team in the future. So today, I will talk about how to build apps with Flutter and in a clean way. We're not using Flutter yet in our production code, but I think it's the same as many other company or for personal interests, right? So I think I'm open for different new frameworks. I like to try them out. Yeah, but we're not using it yet in our company. So before we start, let's walk through a timeline of cross-platform. So in the past, I heard people saying they don't like Flutter, maybe because they have tried 2A or 2B, and none of those tools matched their expectations, right? So they shut down the door for new multi-platform libraries like Flutter completely. It's true that through past years, developers have tried different solutions, right? And different approaches to arrive to a stage, where we have multiple options to choose from. Feels like we're a bit spoiled. So if you haven't tried the Flutter yet, don't dismiss it so quickly. So today I will discuss 2 things. First, I'm going to give you a very brief introduction of Flutter, and then I will explain my approach of how to build it in a clean way with some sample code. So why do we need clean code? Because it allows us to scale, to extend, to adapt changes easily. And before I move on, actually, Flutter uses declarative UI approach. What does this mean, right? So if you compare it to Android, how we do in Android is when we build a UI, a view, we normally code it in XML, and then we inject or bind data to it. But how does Flutter works, or declarative UI approach in general, is you describe the view you want while you're coding and while you add logic to it. So I hope every of my audience is aware that Flutter is developed by Google. This is also the main reason I fought for it, because Google has my trust in its innovations. But unfortunately, this has become also one of the reasons it stopped Flutter to expand to iOS side. That's my view, right? But nevertheless, Flutter has a very big community, and you can build app using Flutter on many platforms. So to use Flutter, you must know widget. It's like a view for Android, but it's more. So if a view is like a piece of a Lego, then a widget is more like a more complete model. There are two types of it. So if you build a static view, you can use stateless widget. It's immutable. That means it doesn't change through its lifetime. So even load data dynamically, you need to extend stateful widget. It keeps track of changes, and the UI is updated based on those changes. So it's mutable, and it can be withdrawn through its lifetime. So with the declarative UI approach, again, as I said before, you can code to describe how the view looks like instead of code the steps to build it. So it's very different from Android. If you want to change the look of say a text field, right? You need to call set text, set color, but with Flutter, the UI reflects to the current state of the app. So if the UI if the state changes, the UI will redraw from scratch. And because Flutter renders UI very quick, as a user, you won't see much difference. And so again, Android and iOS has both released libraries with this approach. So if you compare the code side by side, they actually look very similar. So if you know either Swift UI or Jetpack Compose, I think it might take you 10 minutes to adapt to Flutter. Yeah, but saying so, Flutter isn't just UI tool. Dart is a language you can use for very complex logic. So actually, if you follow clean architecture path, you will mostly use Dart, and you will only need the Flutter in the last layer. Now, before we dive into code, let's take a minute to have a look of the Italian food, right? So there's no right or wrong software architecture approach, or you will never find a perfect solution. So before you start your project, it's always advisable to sit down with your team and to decide which pasta you like. It can be lasagna or can be spaghetti, and choose the best suitable one for your project. Okay, so I'm going to dive into code now. Do we have any questions at this stage? Actually, I can't see the questions.
It doesn't look like there's any questions at this stage, Teresa.
Okay.
Yeah, and there's nothing that's coming through on the chat box in a minute.
Cool. So I'm going to continue. Guys, if you have any question, right, do stop me and ask, and we can actually discuss it. I think it's probably better. One of the most used pattern is probably the presentation domain data layer. It allows you to separate concern and focus on the current piece of work you need. So let's start with presentation, right? This layer is where magic happens. It's the most important layers, most important part of your app, because it interacts with users, right? it doesn't matter how well your logic is, right? How well your logic is performed. But the final user, sorry, the final user judges your app based on UI and UX. So if you fail to deliver this layer, your project might fail. Then the next one, domain layer, contains your business logic, and it's like the brain of your module, of your project. So when you work at this layer, you can completely ignore UI and the data, and treat them as magic, as something you have when you want to have them. Then one layer underneath it is data. So this layer, obviously, it interacts with data. So whether it came from a remote server or come from a database. So this layer is responsible to receive data, to parse it, to store it, and then to send it forward. And thanks for my colleague, Dennis. I'm not sure if he's in the call today. He prepared me with this nice drawing, so I can explain how things works in our project in Tide. So we are following this design in our project, and it's, so actually, because this was drawn in the Android way, so you can see there was activity and a fragment, but ignore the name, right? So how it works is we have data, domain, presentation layers. So the Flutter design isn't very far away from it, because framework might change, but architecture always stays the same, right? As you can see, we have narrowed scope, and we divide responsibilities into different zones. So depends on the complexity of your module. Each layer might be divided even further down. So you might wonder why you see repository twice in data and in domain. This is because it interacts with data. So the actual implementation of repository stays in data layer. And in order to hide it, hide the implementation, we provide abstract class of it in the domain. So this came from the golden rule of high-level module should not depend on low-level module, but they both should depend on abstractions. So let's talk about Flutter now, finally. This is just a sample project, right? So we built the most famous of my list view. And this overview of how the project looks like. Yeah, and also because I work for a financial service, so I'm gonna build a list view that displays account transactions. And again, I'm not gonna do live coding because we know normally how it ends. I know some developers prefer to divide modules into data module, domain module, and the UI. And each module has like maybe 100 features. But actually, it's better to build a feature module, a vertical feature module has its own ecosystem. So if, for example, one API service change, you don't have to recompile the entire code base. So first, it doesn't matter which layer you begin with, but I prefer to start with data. Also in this example, I'm using Chopper library because it's actually very similar with retrofit. So as you can see in the API service, we have an item, it's called a future. It handles a sync task, and as a replacement of RX or coroutine in Android. A future has 3 states: incomplete, complete with value, or complete with error. So how this flow works is like this, right? You press the button, and within the same thread, the handler sends out HTTP request. At the same time, you will receive a future object. But at this moment, this object, sorry, at this moment, this object is empty and it's incomplete. So you need to be a bit patient and you want to wait. Eventually, you're going to receive some data in a callback. And you can either pass it on using the keyword await, or you can consume it in the same function with the keyword then. Another thing I want to talk about is the DTO model. So it's unique in data layer. How basically it follows the JSON structure coming from your API response. So one DTO might contain multiple data objects in it, and it's perfectly fine because we will filter it, we will parse it using data mapper. You might add a mapper in every layer, but it's essential for data layer. This is because API endpoints, it's not designed for one screen or one flow. So you might receive a very big DTO model, but you need to remove fields irrelevant for your module. That's why we need a mapper here. So for apps that requires, for example, caching or database storage, you only need to cache what is needed. Right. Do we have any questions here? I mean, we can have some discussion if there are any. But I'm sorry, I can't see it with my screen.
See the chat box, Teresa. There's one that's just come up from Kima.
Right, I have to exit my presentation to see it.
Okay, yep, if you want to do that.
Are you able to read the question for me? Because I don't think I can see it.
Yeah, it should come up on the chat box. It is, so if you go on the actual Zoom call, it should be under there on the chat box. You ever see that? Or is it not coming up for you?
I see that, no?
Yeah.
If Flutter is not cross-platform, what is the point we are learning another new language, Dart, for Android development only? So first of all, Flutter is cross-platform. Maybe I'm confused with when I say something, right? So Flutter is cross-platform, but Flutter is not multi-platform. So the difference is, for example, if you use Kotlin multi-platform library, you compile this into a library, and you can use the library in your native code. Like you can call a function from the library, use it as any other SDK. Flutter is cross-platform, but because you can launch Flutter and let Flutter handle everything from there, you can use Flutter in your native code or have your native code in Flutter, but it doesn't interact with your code in one class. It works more or less like a web view. You launch it and you let that view handles everything inside it. Sorry, did I answer you that question? Or if I misread it?
We'll just give it a moment. See if that's fine.
Okay.
Yeah, I think you're clear to carry on.
Okay, well, I'm going to close it. I'm going to go back to the present mode. Cool. So now let's look at repository in data layer. So this layer, it provides clean API, so the app can retrieve things easily. It contains logic of data, whether it's from a server or from a database. So the layer above can request clean data without worrying where it was, how it's fetched, or how it's been made. our repository is made of API service and mapper. So here you will make request to a server and receive data, map it and pass it on. You might have noticed right up to this point, we are using Dart only. We haven't even used anything from Flutter yet. And from the code I've shown, right? It looks like very close to Java or Kotlin, which I think is nice because the interaction to framework should only occurs at the last stage when we build UI layers. So now, assume we finished data layer, we have our repository, we can move on to domain, the brain of the project. So usually you have 3 items in this layer. You have model, you have repository, which is interface, and you have use case. Again, optional, but we will discuss it. So as we discussed already, domain model is different from DTO, and it's structured in a way to suit your app logic. It's not how your backend is. So I think there were some other questions, but yeah, I will stop after this slide. And a domain model isn't just a plain data holder, and it contains data and some actions and behaviors. For example, now check. Repository class in domain, again, is abstract, right? We use it to prevent direct access data from other layers. So Tommy, I think we will have someone asking questions. Should I pause here or should I continue?
Yeah, if you feel free to answer the questions. Yeah, there's another one here from Yaxi. Can you see that one?
Yeah. So let me read it, right? Flutter is very good at building app cross-platform with unified look and feel. So it's good at building apps that doesn't require much hardware interaction, like a camera. Yes. So in what situation you would not recommend using Flutter to replace the native way? In what situation I would not? Let's say, if you want to use Flutter, it's recommendable you use Flutter as much as you can. So for example, if I'm using Kotlin multi-platform today, I can use Kotlin multi-platform. I can use Kotlin for the made for Android. I can use Android, right? It can be a very mixed project. But if you decide to use Flutter, it's the same as if you use React Native. It's better if you go as much as you can. But again, I think this year Flutter released the function app to app. That means you can add any native code in your Flutter project. So if you create a Flutter project, you see that there were 3 packages, right? You have library, which has your Dart code. Then you have Android, which is the same as your Android project. And then you have iOS package, which is the same as any empty iOS project. Thank you, sorry. Richard asked another question, but let me finish this one first. So in this way, you can actually interact, for example, camera or Bluetooth or a fingerprint, Face ID in your Flutter. You need to go to your iOS folder in your Flutter project and Android folder, code functions you need in there in your native code. And then you create a bridge, right? There's like something called Flutter activity, Flutter fragment. That's your bridge. In that bridge, you can launch native code inside the Flutter directly. So you don't need to build another library or jump out of it. So you can actually continue. So other question is, can I reuse this Dart code in an iOS app? Yes. The point of having, okay, so add to app, there were 2 parts of it, right? You can add Flutter to your native project. So you can package Flutter code as a library, right? And then you can use them in your iOS app, but you cannot use Flutter module as any like a normal, like a standalone library. You can call a function or use part of your Flutter library as a support function. It doesn't interact with your code in that way. So you can reuse it, but there were limitations. What IDE would you recommend? Can you develop that code? Okay, IDE-wise, there were, I think, yes, you can use Android Studio or IntelliJ, OVS. I don't think you can use Dart in Xcode, because if you want to use Flutter in Android Studio, you need to add the plugin. But I don't think you have the same plugin in Xcode, unless they provide something later on. So at the moment, I don't think you can. But Android Studio, yes, definitely. So I hope I answered everyone's question. Okay, cool. So I'm going to go back to my slides. Thank you. Once I finish, we can discuss this even more. Sorry. So now, let's talk about use case, right? Use case is actually a very funny topic, because in our team, we talked about use case quite a lot, of whether it's necessary or should we have it. Because say if you have a use case, right? Sometimes a use case might look like a duplicate of your repository. For example, this code, right? If you, I'd say, actually, if you look at how the use case is made, you don't have to have it, because it's like a wrap of your repository, and the function is actually the same as what you have in your repo. But again, if your project is really big and you have like 15 developers working on one code base, it's better to keep things in a consistent way. So then you protect yourself from future UI or data change. Use case is actually useful when you need more than one repository in use case. So because remember, so one repository equals one DTO entity, not per screen, right? So when you build your screen, you might want to use more than one DTO. So you might have account repository or user repository in one screen. So that's why use case is very helpful. So now we can talk about Flutter actually, but I'm gonna keep it very short, because in presentation layer, there were, again, different patterns you can use. So for example, you have MVP, MVVM, or block. Block is actually very, it's recommended by Google, and it's probably the most popular UI design patterns in Flutter. Or you can just use use case instead in like the sample here. By the way, block stands for business logic controller. So which layer, which pattern you want to use, it's entirely up to you. Again, I'm not going to discuss in detail which pattern does what, because that's going to be another very big topic. So let's assume you have the data coming from repository, coming from use case you need in your UI layers, and then you build it as a list view. And by the way, list view in Flutter is so much easier and compared with Android, because you don't need XML, no adapter, no view holder. So yeah, basically on the right side, that's the final result of how this list view looks like. So yeah, some rules I think to you can follow to make sure your code is clean, right? And we use dependency inversion principle to isolate domain layer. And outer layer should depend on inner layer, not the other way around. And depend on the size of your project. So if you build an app that has only one package, you can split the layers between classes. You can have a domain class, UI class, and data class. And if your app is made with one module, you can split the layers with package. You have a domain package, data package, and UI package. So if app has multiple modules, it's recommended to build a feature module, has its own ecosystem, has its own UI, domain, data, instead of having one big horizontal UI, domain, and data modules. Okay, yeah, thank you. So that's basically all I want to discuss today. Thank you. I'm going to, should I stop sharing?
Yeah, you can do, Teresa. Yeah, cheers for that talk. Obviously, does anyone have any questions now that Teresa's finished? Obviously, put that down in the chat box, and I'm sure she'll be able to answer them for you.
Maybe I'll leave my screen on in case we need to go back to some slides.
Yeah, probably worth it.
Right. I'm going to read it. So, doesn't layers per feature prevent reuse of code? How granular are your features? Prevent reuse of code depends. So again, how you structure your project is heavily depend on how your backend is. For us, say if you use if your backend is built in a way of a microservice, right? Then you should you should structure your project mirroring your backend. So let's say Zoom, right? If you build an app, a Zoom app, you can have a module which is just to provide a chat, or a module which is a core, like a foundation, and the networking, authentication, analytics. So how you divide your module, there's no rules, right? It's really depends on how your backend is actually, or how your team is structured. Sorry, I think I'm a bit lost. By feature, allow you to remove and change it. How do we avoid code duplication if each feature has its own domain data layer? Okay. Yes, actually, what depends on what. So the question is how do we avoid code duplications if each feature has its own domain and data layer? Again, as I said in before, one domain and one DTO is you have your repository is responsible for one DTO, and the one DTO means it's one API call. So it's not duplication. It looks like the code is the same, right, from outside of your implementation. So you open each feature has data, has domain, has UI. Package level, they're the same, but the implementation in each of those packages are different. So you're not actually duplicate the code. It's just how you structure it. You might have one data layer, right, that responsible for 100 of API call. Actually, if you count the lines of code you have, it might be the same as if you structure them in a feature module. So imagine you have 3 drawers, or you have one big drawer with everything in it. The item inside this furniture might be the same, but you divide them into different drawers. I hope I answered that question. So The next one is there's a lot of issue opened in GitHub. Should that be a concern? Is Flutter limit at this stage? I think there are a lot of issues open in GitHub in any popular open source project, even for Android. So I don't think it's a concern. And I think it actually is a good point of people actually starting to contribute to this project. I would be worried if there's no issues. I wouldn't go for this project if there's no PR, if there's no errors, no issue. That means no one is using it. The limitation on Flutter is it doesn't provide same function as what Android could provide, right? Because when you build a Flutter, you still have to go to native part of the code, but you have the option now. When Flutter was released in 2008, you don't have add to app feature at that time, so you can't even go native. So you can add Flutter to your native project, but now you can. Does mirroring the structure of the backend tightly couple your app to the backend architecture? I don't think so, because when we start working in our sprint, right, we normally sit down with backend to discuss how the API contract looks like. We don't care how they implement the actual function. We care about the JSON they provide to us, right? That's a contract we will work together. To arrive to that contract, backend might have different architecture. They might follow clear architecture, they might follow different things, but the contract is always the same. So I don't actually get the question. Maybe I wasn't understanding it. Doesn't matter how you structure your project. Again, if anything change on the backend, you have to change your project, right? And we are trying to find the in a way where backend change has minimum impact on your front end code. In this way, if you have your feature module has data domain presentation, if something changes in the backend, that means you only need to go to one module, one feature module, change only one layer data, right? In that module, you don't have to recompile or rewrite everything. And I hope that answers your question. Next one. What's the actual status of Flutter Web? Do you think it will go on? I think you had to use the master branch already for Flutter Web. You can check out master branch. I could be wrong because I think Flutter Web isn't released yet, but you can use the master branch. Again, functions in Flutter Web is not as rich as for mobile, because they start Flutter Web after mobile was released. I tried it myself. One thing I really like is it does provide responsive UI. So you can use Flutter and build a web app, and you don't even need native. Sorry, I need to drink some. I think there were talks in a community of releasing Flutter Web, and we are actually looking forward for it to be released. So next question, how much does it help if I go deep on calling to improve Flutter knowledge? I have a year working on Flutter, but I say that companies looking for native knowledge too. How much? I think from my point of view, right, even if we use Flutter, and there's always the need to the requirement to know some native knowledge. using Flutter doesn't mean you don't need to study the native app or you can forget about it. Actually, using Flutter that means you can be a mobile developer. You don't have to be Android or iOS. So I come from Android background. Now, if I learn Flutter, that means I have to also pick up some iOS knowledge to build iOS app. So it enables you to be the T-shape, right? So you specialized in Flutter and you widen your knowledge in native side of things. Or in the future, if we use Flutter Web, maybe you can learn something for Web too. And depends, again, you don't have to go really deep in Swift or Kotlin. It didn't take me much time to learn Dart, for example, because Dart is really similar to Java, in my opinion. It's not far away from Kotlin as well, apart from I have to use a semicolon. So language-wise, I think they are very similar. You might have to know something about iOS and Android on framework. How, for example, how do you build activity in Android in case you need to use some native things like Bluetooth, fingerprint, right? You need to know Android framework. Language-wise, I think you don't have to go really, really deep. Next question, how easy it is to implement and manage animations in Flutter compared to iOS and Android? Actually, I'm quite impressed how easily you can use animations in iOS. Android is something I always complain about, animation. It doesn't work as well as iOS. Sorry to say that, I'm Android developer, but I know animation is something I don't fancy it much in Android. But yeah, Flutter, to be honest, anything with UI, animation, using Flutter is like, you save me a code from 10 lines to 1 line. So since you need animation, right, you need to probably to create many, many things in Android. With Flutter, it's probably just 10 lines of code. And also the rendering time is also very, very quick as well. So one more question. How does Flutter contrast with React Native? I don't think I can answer this question well because I never used React Native. I mean, I know it's based on JavaScript but so I never used React Native. Actually, before Flutter was there, I wasn't really fancy cross-platform tool because I haven't come to a very I know it, but I never wanted to use them in my production code because I still like the native look and feel in my project, not like a web view, right? I mean, React Native is actually very native already, but I never use it, sorry.
I think that looks like it. Maybe it, Teresa, on the questions. No, thanks again. Oh wait, is that one last one?
Yeah.
Is that one last one?
It's okay. Sorry, I stopped sharing my slides. So if I need to go back to it, I will share it again. Would you say Flutter increase the complexity of the development? Sorry. Again, depends. So if you are building something completely brand new, right? It wouldn't increase the complexity because it's brand new. You can use Flutter or you can use native. And maybe you found Flutter easier, so you can code faster, or maybe you code native faster, but using Flutter for a new project does increase the complexity. But again, if you have a native app already, and then you want to add Flutter on top of it, it might actually make your project more complex than going one way. So because Flutter has limitations of how it can be used as a library. at this point, my opinion is, if I want to use Flutter, I will use Flutter 100% as much as I can. It doesn't add any complexity. But if you want to mix Flutter with a native code, there might be issues, yes. Sounds like Flutter is solving many problems Android developer facing, but not iOS. Could you explain what is actually the problem that Flutter could not solve for iOS? I think that the problem for iOS, in my view, is because I think, first of all, sorry to say this, I think Swift is a very good language. And iOS, the framework-wise, iOS is a very good framework. It's like if you use Mac for 10 years and you don't want to switch to another different type of computer, right? Because you get used to it. Also because Flutter is developed by Google, so naturally there is some resistance, right? I think you can code anything you want. Sorry. With Flutter, either on Android or comparing to iOS, but the resistance comes from different side, not Flutter related directly.
Perfect. Well, yeah, I think that looks like it. Yeah, no, they have another one came up there. No, well, that looks like it's it, Teresa. But thanks again for obviously taking the time out to obviously present your talk. Yeah, really enjoyed that. Thanks to everyone as well who attended. Good to see so many people again. Like I mentioned, got a number of talks over the next few weeks, so stay in touch on the group. But yeah, thanks again, Teresa, and yeah, we'll be speaking soon anyway.
Yeah. Thank you for everyone to join, and also the talk I have done today. I have written them down in the blog posts, and I'll share with Tommy. And if anyone wanted to have a look, please do give me more comments, and I will try to answer questions in there.
Oh, perfect. That's great. Yeah, we'll get something posted out on the comments section on the meetup page after. As I mentioned to the guys before, this is obviously recorded, so people can obviously look at that back, share it with your colleagues or who you'd like to share that with. But take care, guys. Obviously, everyone stay safe, and yeah, we'll speak soon. Take care.
Evening.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.